All right, back in the shop. So, as mentioned before, I'm gonna start building the motor. Got everything all kind of specced out. Got my measurements done, and now I'm just starting to put together my pistons. So, first thing you got to do, obviously, is make sure that your piston to bore clearance is good. So, I took a mic and measured the skirt of the piston. So these particular pistons are pretty cool because they have a little area right there with no coating on there. So that's where you're supposed to mic them at. Some pistons don't have that, and then you're actually measuring that coating, and you're not supposed to measure the coating. You're supposed to measure the piston itself. So I measured the piston, went across there, measured my bore, subtracted the difference, and I have about 1.2 thousandths or 12 10,000ths clearance on most of them, and they vary a little bit, but that is good. Then what I did was check my ring gap, in gap on the ring. So I took my rings before I put them onto the piston, stuck them in the bore, stuck a feeler gauge in there, measured those out, and I got plenty of clearance on that. The gap on here, I don't know if you can see that, a little gap on the end right here. So basically, if those are too close together, when this engine heats up and expands, that gap is going to start to close. And if that gap doesn't have enough room to actually close and the ring keeps expanding, then you're just going to seize it up and you're going to tear up the ring. So all of these measurements are really critical to make an engine running right. So I set all the gaps on there, so kind of a pain. I didn't show all that because it's very monotonous and it takes a while. So got all that stuff all set up, and then I'm ready to start installing the pistons. So these are full floating pins, which are pretty cool. Full floating pin, obviously, floats. Some of them are semi-floating. Semi-floating are actually, you have to heat up the end of the rod. So these particular rods have a little bushing in the end of them. The other style rods don't. So you actually have to heat these up in a rod heater and expand them, and then right away you gotta slip these two bad boys together. Well, this style you don't. These full floaters are really cool. So as you can see, it fits right over the end like butter. So this style, all you have to do is get one of your wrist pin clips like this little guy right here and stick it on here. I know you can't see this, but it's not that difficult. So you just stick it in there. It's got a little groove. Make sure that it snaps into the groove all the way around. Very, very important. You can't have it hang out just a little bit, which I actually did. Bonk. There we go. So now it's snapped in. Should probably be wearing my reading spectacles for all this so I don't make a mistake. Oh, look at there. All right. So yeah, that's definitely down in the groove. So take your pin out, slap a little simile lube on here. You can use oil or whatever you want on here. I'm using red Loctite because I don't want the pins to come out. Maybe not Loctite. It's a simile lube. Probably shouldn't say that too loudly because some people might actually do that. Hey, put Loctite in there. That's a great idea. Yeah, not so much. All right, so these all have to go together in a particular way. So you can see on there, little dot. Dot always faces forward in the engine. And we have another dot on the rods. The dot faces away from the dot. No dot together, dots go apart. Also, there's a little bit thicker material, a little bit thicker on this side than it is on this side. The thick side faces the dot. So, a couple different references on how to get those in there correctly. And you got to pay attention. This stuff is all critical, that all this stuff lines up the same way. Bad mojo will happen if installed incorrectly. Alright, so it just slips together, and put our next little pin in here. Click. The click of life. All right. So little clips go in there. Make sure that's nice and maneuverable. You don't want any binding on there. So rinse and repeat. All you got to do is 6 more of those bad boys. So that's pretty easy. So got the crank in. Rods and pistons are going next. All right, so now we're going to start installing the pistons. Obviously leaving the cam or the cap off. The way I like to line up my rings is just have the gaps opposite. I like to have them on the non-thrust side, although it doesn't matter because they're going to spin anyway. The crosshatch in the cylinder is made for the piston or the rings to kind of spin around and seat. But as long as all the gaps are kind of away from each other, should be good to go. Dot always goes forward. Dot on the rod, going backwards. All my pins are in, everything is nice and loose. So, stick this guy in here. And it doesn't really matter what kind of ring compressor this you have. They have some really cool ones that are exactly the size that you need and they just pop in there. This one seems to be pretty good about this thing since I've been having so many problems with this engine destroying. But they make a lot of different ones, so just kind of set that up. Get it relatively straight on there. You want a little bit of the sleeve sticking out so that when she goes in there, don't have much room in there. It's a pretty tight fit. So you may have noticed I put that bearing in dry. I'm going to check my rod bearing clearances. Make sure that those are good. So I put it in dry to start with. And a little tap, make sure it's nice and flat. Boom, send it home. Now when you do that, you got to be careful because if the rings pop out underneath here before they go in the cylinder, obviously it's going to stop. So it should be a nice, easy, fluid motion as it goes down in there. If you feel any resistance whatsoever, stop right away because the ring probably popped out and then just start over. So crankshaft is in bottom dead center. Means the rod journal on the crank is all the way straight down. Don't make it top dead center with it up because when you flip it over, it's too hard to get the cap on there. So you're supposed to have rod protectors on there so that you don't scratch the crank. I don't have any, but I line everything up nice and straight so the rod is actually hanging straight. Gravity seems to work pretty good. And just kind of get my hand down in here when I get close. Use my fingers to guide it in. Send it. Send it, baby. All right. Now, so I mentioned before that I moved this, or made this stand a little bit taller, and it's awesome. I mean, I'm right here. I don't have to bend over. It's absolutely perfect. All right, so lined up. Now I'm going to get my plastic gauge. And I got a cam cap around here somewhere. Should have probably got all this prepared before, right? So just your basic plastic gauge. Stuff works pretty good. I did do some miking on here before and everything's close, but I wanted to show you guys how the plastic gauge is. So plastic gauge is designed for each one of these scales right here is the size of plastic that you need. So take your fingers and rip it, right? So now I got just this little piece right here, and then voila, little piece of plastic. So you want to make sure that it's relatively clean and lay the plastic on the journal without dropping it, because if you drop it, might as well start over and just get another one, because you're not going to find it. And then the tabs, little tabs on here, little tabs. Those always line up on the rod bearings, but they're actually opposite on the main bearings. So, a little confusing. Engineers have such a sense of humor. They could have made all this stuff the same. Just like the dots on the pistons, I was just looking at that. Dots on the pistons go forward, and then the dot that's on the rod goes backwards. Why not just line them up, dot to dot? Wouldn't that make sense? Of course it would. Well, if it makes sense, it makes dollars. Bam, catchphrase. All right, so a little torque wrench over here. So these are ARP bolts, and I can reuse these. If you're doing these with stock bolts, you want to tighten those up with the stock bolts. Crush them all down in there, and then throw those bolts away and get some new ones, because those are torque to yield bolts. Basically, they are stretchy bolts, and it cannot be reused, but you don't want to stretch the new bolts. So use the old bolts just to check this. So they say give it a couple minutes to squish the plastic, so let it sit there for a second. You all thought that I was going to take that off with the torque wrench, didn't you? Technically you can. They say never go backwards with the torque wrench. They're full of malarkey. You can go backwards with the torque wrench all day long. People say if you go backwards with the torque wrench, it's going to ruin the calibration. Well, how do you torque left-handed bolts? With a torque wrench. You put it on the off position. There is a level of accuracy going on and off, but you can definitely use a torque wrench backwards. It's you could check your torque when you're removing a bolt. If you're having a problem, perhaps you spun a bearing or something after you built a motor and you want to kind of do some investigation, you can use the torque wrench for the breakaway torque and see if they were all torqued right. So going backwards on a torque wrench is no big deal. You don't want to use it as a ratchet, but you can definitely go backwards. All right, so pretty difficult to actually see. I don't know if you can see that. A little part on the bearing itself. Kind of hard to see, but the one on the crankshaft is a little bit easier, so that's the one I'm going to use. How you doing, huh? Alright, let me get this thing flipped around. Got the sniffles today. Alright, so yeah, it's going to be tough to see. Alright, so we can do this bad boy in metric or America. And looks like a little bit wider. My little screen on my camera is so small I have no idea if you guys can actually see this, but I can. So it's actually a little bit wider than 2000s and a little smaller than 0015, so I'm calling it 0017. So 17 10,000ths or 1.7 thou. I think that's good. Where are we at? Beep. So that should be good. So I'll check a few more of those just to make sure. But that's a good oil clearance, so I should have some killer oil pressure on this thing. So now I'm ready to actually install it. Put a little bit of lube on there, put it in there, torque it down, and then I'll move on to the next one. So once again, rinse and repeat. Got 8 of these to do. I'm not going to bore you with sticking all 8 of them in there. So I'll let you know how I'm doing. All right, got all the pistons in. I'm all torqued down to the ARP specifications. Camshaft was already put in before. Chain tensioner's on there, so now we're working on getting the oil pump on. So I took the oil pump apart just to give it an inspection because I blew this engine up, so I don't want any problems. And sure enough, there was a little bit of metal in there. Had a little shrapnel. So that's what the inside of a pump looks like. This little plate goes on top of there. It's pretty easy to get apart, obviously. It's just a few bolts, but just cleaned it up. Got a couple little hairline scratches on there, but that's no big deal. So I'm going to lube that up. I don't want to start it dry, and just put some assembly lube in there, stuff I've been using for the rest of the engine. Lube that up all nice and good so it primes the oiling system a little bit easier. Put that on and then get the rest of it built. All right, oil pump's on, it's all cleaned up. Got the windage tray. Keep forgetting what this thing's called. There's a windage tray here. Got that all put on, and now I'm looking at my pickup tube. So you can see that, yeah, oil pump was working. It sucked up all that crap in there, so it actually bent my pickup tube a little bit. See a little ding on there, it kind of tweaked it. So now I need to rebuild that. I have another pickup tube from another engine, so I'm going to reconfigure that, get that all mocked up and put in there so it'll fit on my, whoa, there I am. It'll fit on my pan, so that's my next step. All right, so there's the short block. It's all put together, actually stuffed back in the car. Was going to put the heads on, and then my ARP studs for my LS1 do not work on this 5.3, so I'm having to go get some bolts today, head bolts. But other than that, she's pretty much together. Slap the heads on, the intake, headers, that's fairly easy. But yeah, she's all done. Dots are all going forward on the pistons, that's a good thing. So came together pretty good. A couple little differences here and there on some of the parts. One of the other issues I'm having is the lifter guides that go in there. They're not going to work, so I'm going to have to grab some other ones, but that's pretty easy. And those are these guys right here. That's the lifter guide, and that's supposed to go, hold on there, that's supposed to go down in that hole right there. But as you can see, that little notch right there sticking out, well, my other one didn't have that, so it doesn't work. Now I could actually kind of cut this piece, make a little notch in there, but I think I can get some of those pretty easily. So slip those in, and then get my bolts, head bolts today, slap the heads on tomorrow, and basically it should be ready to start pretty quick. Man, oh man, talk about a stressful build. O to the MG. Finally got her done. See that back there somewhere? Where's it at? Yeah. Got her done. Had a bunch of different issues. Had to get a different front cover. The front cover I got was wrong for the cam sensor placement, and just a bunch of little things. Wrong head bolts, I think I mentioned that. But finally got it done. It's Friday, I'm going to the dunes tomorrow. Been up since the wee early hours putting this bad boy together. So you always see on TV where they do these engine builds, and then they do the first fire up and everybody's high-fiving because it starts instantly. Well, let's see if that's going to happen. I'm going to record all this and see if it actually works. Just getting the coolant put in there. As you can see, a little funnel right there. So I'm just putting coolant in. I already have oil in it. And a couple of the little things that I had to do. I got different valve covers. So the old valve covers, which is on the old perimeter bolt heads. I relocated my coils to the bottom and actually milled off all the original bungs for the bolts that hold the coils on. So I'll put my coils down here. You can see, kind of cool, right? Those are underneath the header and stuff. So, and then on these valve covers had the same thing. They had bungs going all the way down them, so makes for kind of a ugly engine. These LSs are kind of ugly anyway. You got to dress them up quite a bit. So I ground all the plastic off of this intake a long time ago when I first built it, which makes it look a million times better. And then I did that on the valve covers, ground off or milled off all the little bungs on there, ground them down, powder coated them. So got that all ready to go. So yeah, I think we're ready to start it. So I will set the camera up and do a live first start, see how it goes. Alright, do a couple little primes, get some gas in there. Here we go. Well, that was kind of a stressful couple of weeks, but the end result, got her done. She's all loaded up, ready for the dunes. Dune hauler over there, kind of a cool little camper that I picked up not too long ago. So yeah, runs, sounds pretty good. Had kind of a weird little start on that very first take. So it did not start the first time. Took 2 times, but I think it's just relearning itself. So cranked it up a few more times and it sounds amazing. So what better place to go break in the engine than the dunes all full of sand, right? Yeah, well, we'll see what happens. But thanks for hanging out on this little series. Next one will be another dunes video. Another epic video too, President's Day weekend. Sorry, kind of in the shade there. So stay tuned for that. So if you like what you're seeing, Fat Nate says like it, subscribe, and ring that bell. Thanks for listening.